Glenn Loury here. This is the Glenn Show. We're the black guys at bloggingheads.tv.
Across, I want to establish a different framework for the dialogue, which is subsequently carried out. Here's the way I put it in the final chapter. I'm saying I'm trying to make it possible for a social scientist to use IQ as an independent variable in a regression equation without getting his career ruined. You know?
Yeah, I remember reading that.
That's not much to ask.
But it didn't used to be that way, by the way. Let me just report. When I was in graduate school in the 1970s, it was not even controversial. You run a wage regression. You're trying to explain how wages vary in a population, and you have a measure, the AFQT or whatever it is, of cognitive ability, and you put it on the right-hand side, and it does explain some of the variation in wages amongst people. There's also common sense that people who can calculate better and who can comprehend better are going to be more effective in their employment and therefore will get higher wages. So it is an extreme ideological imposition to preclude putting that on the right-hand side of the regression, it seems to me. And that was commonly accepted amongst empirical economists and of my generation going back 30, 40 years. But things have changed.
Yes, it has. And that's why I mentioned the book by, well, I'm not sure if I did this.
You didn't, but you can mention it now.
There's a book by a woman named Helen Pluckrose and a man named James Lindsay called Cynical Theories. And where they do a really good job of explaining why this is not a woke ideology that came about in 2014 or 2015. They trace the roots of this back to the beginnings of postmodernism in the 1960s. They show how it developed in a variety of ways. And so when you say it used to be different about running regression equations, you were still, and I was still functioning in a world in which the postmodernists were kind of a weird group of deconstructionists in literature and so forth. And then it started to move into the social sciences more slowly. And what's happened in the last 25, 30 years is that's taken over to a very large degree in a way that it had not taken over when you were doing your analyses in the 1980s. And unless you understand the breadth of this spread of this movement, I don't think you understand the danger we are in, because here's what's scary to me is that I thought that it was academics that were mostly the people engaged in this kind of thinking. And last summer said to me, nope, you're talking about the mainstream ideology at the New York Times and the Washington Post and down the list. And that is really, really scary because those are the gatekeepers for what's respectable thinking.
Let me see if I'm getting you. So there's a threat from the left and there's a threat from the right. You haven't talked about the threat from the right yet. The threat from the left around a kind of relativism that makes racially equal outcomes the god of their attention, and then looks away from facts and kind of anti-rational and things like, I can't explain differences amongst individuals and their earnings in the labor market by reference to, amongst other things, differences in their cognitive ability. Give an example of that. But what is the threat from the right?
This is where disaster is looming the closest. And I'm going to give a somewhat different take on it than probably other people have, but I'm not really worried about the white supremacists and the white nationalists. I think they're a very small component of the right. I'll tell you who I'm worried about. I'm worried about all of the working class and middle class whites who have had it beaten into their, they can't turn on the TV without yet another reference to the fact that they are bad people, that they have white privilege, that they have been the cause of blacks' problems and the problems of people of color in general, and that they had better take their ways or else. And an awful lot of these people are angered by this in a very visceral way. They're saying to themselves, hey, I have Black colleagues at work, Latino work coworkers, and people in my neighborhood, and I treat them with respect and I treat them with friendship. I have not behaved as a racist. I am trying to raise my kids and get them through college and make ends meet, and I'm working my ass off, and I sure don't see that I have any white privilege. And so you will not see an in-depth reporting on this kind of white person by the mainstream media. At least I haven't seen it. That's got to be a big number of people. And now let's get to the specifics here. Blacks constitute 12.7% of the population as of 2020. All right. Latinos are about 18% of the population. And let's face it, an awful lot of the energy for the progressive critical race theory is coming from Blacks specifically. So now you got 13% of the population there. Non-Latino whites still constitute 60% of the population. That's way down from 30, 40 years ago, but it's still 60%. What is the proportion of that 60% who are really, really getting pissed? What is the proportion of them who are, and here's where the danger is, Glenn, are starting to say to themselves, well, guess what? I'm an identity too. And you want to play identity politics? Okay, we can go with that playbook. And if you get a substantial proportion of whites who not just voted for Donald Trump, you can have voted for Donald Trump for all sorts of reasons that doesn't make you far right. But no, it's no longer that. It's no longer political in the sense it was before. It's a much more racially grounded fight than it was before. Now, do I know for a fact that you have this phenomenon going on? I can point to indicators. But how much of that is the result of the last couple of years, and how much of that has been growing because of white middle class and working class anger at the elites that goes back to the 1990s? I don't know about that. I'm saying that if whites start to play identity politics, then basically we're facing some kind of disaster. I don't know how it's going to play out.
What are the indicators that you could point to?
The mask thing. Why should it be that what ordinarily would be a very simple question of this is what you do when you got a public health problem, and here's the evidence on masks, and should we do it or should we not? There would still be some disagreement. It wouldn't have broken as dramatically as it did red state, blue state. And it really did break dramatically in terms of red state, blue state. The whole anger on the right well, I'm trying to what are the specific indicators? It's so hard to get whites to talk honestly about race, even among themselves.
Yeah. Even
among themselves. That I can't prove what I'm about to say. I suspect it's out there. And that is a shift away from racism as a moral issue to racism as a kind of, or the accusations of racism, as a kind of attack on them as people.
Yeah,
I'm struggling with this because I'm thinking of, because I'm old enough to remember the 1950s and the early 1960s, and if you aren't that old, I was growing up in the Midwest, and I went to Harvard, and so I was not in a Southern environment at all. But it's also true that whites were genuinely had their view of the problem fundamentally changed in the 1950s and early 1960s. Whites really did, in an uncomplicated way, say we have really oppressed Blacks in the past. What we have done is unconscionable, and we have to fix it. And it was not something that was coerced out of them as something they ought to feel. It was a deeply felt thing. And the triumph of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, I think, is a reflection of that. And it wasn't very long after that, within the next 3 or 4 years, that in a way, the whole civil rights thing was handed over to the lawyers. So it was no longer, if you're an employer, it was no longer, we never even bothered to interview Blacks before. Come on, we've got to reach out and find Blacks who want these jobs and interview them and hire them if we can. It changed from that to, if we don't have enough Blacks, the EEOC is going to be coming down on us. And or do we have enough to be safe? You know, and that diffused a lot of the moral thing. But then there was another transition that I'm worried about now. Because even then, people who started to think about dealing with the effects of racism legalistically, they still thought it was a good idea, by and large. You know, they didn't like some of the aspects of it, but it's still the thing you needed to do. The transition I'm talking about now is from, gee, I wish, you know, I didn't have to worry about all these rules and regulations regarding hiring, regarding if I'm a policeman, the way I behave and so forth. It's transferring from that to a more fundamental and more emotional, I've had it. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of Blacks complaining about this and that and the other thing. It's time to suck it up. Nobody knows what the size of that reaction is, but it's got to be out there.
I'm thinking about a book I read a long time ago by a German political scientist named Elisabeth Neumann called The Spiral of Silence. And her argument was, it was in the early decades after Nazism, and she was talking about German political opinion. And there was a line, there was a script that you were supposed to say as a decent German about Hitler and all of that. And of course, Hitler was Hitler. But the rise of Hitler was a complicated and profound development in German political culture. And it had many aspects to it, you know, that were nuanced and complex. But the line that you're supposed to say in public was a very narrow line. She speculated that a lot of people had problems with that line, thought outside the boundaries of what was acceptable opinion, but, you know, you just didn't say it. And because you didn't say it, no one else knew how many of you like-minded people might have said it. And her point was, this is unstable. This thing can unravel. And when it begins to unravel, it could be overnight and you look up and you've got a completely different world. It's a very dangerous situation. And I feel that way. I don't know what you'd say to this about our time around the racial questions. I just wonder, so I'm agreeing with you here, how many statues you can take down of founding fathers, how many crowing exhibitions you can give about the demographics making white people into a minority. It's going to be a minority country soon enough. White people are desperate. They're being marginalized. But how many books you can in effect ban because they use a word out of, you know, the lexicon that's supposed to be acceptable. How many accusations of racism that you can throw around and not engender a backlash? I mean, if a white person were to stand up and say, wait a minute, what about my civilization? And then call attention to the Enlightenment or call attention to modern medicine would rest on a foundation of science, almost all of which is a product of European intellectual development. And so on. So where's your civilization? If a white person were to say that, I mean, could you really blame them? Well, yeah, you can blame them because it's racist to say that. You can't keep them from thinking it. If the only thing you have to say about crime, policing, and violence in the country is white cops killing Black kids, how are you going to stop someone in suburban St. Louis or Baltimore or whatever from looking at the newspaper and coming to the conclusion, well, no. It's Black thugs who are killing each other and white people and everybody else besides. And I dare not drive into that city. I certainly wouldn't open a business there. And I moved my family 20 years ago. How are you going to stop them from saying that? So I want to say to the advocates of racial equity, can we talk about human opportunity, about American obligation to one another? If you don't think the schools are working, let's fix the schools for everybody. If you think the cops are too violent, I'm fine with that. We can investigate that for everybody. Don't make it into a racial thing, because you cannot contain that. Once it, and as you say, once the white identity politics thing gets real, you say game over, and I find it hard to argue with you about it.